And now, welcome, John Rafferty, more known as Johnnie Walker. It is a very pleasure. It's a nice pleasure for me to have you here as my guest on the project Passos del Camino.
And for
Uh,
me, good morning.
Thank you so much, and good morning for you too. So, do you one of the things that I read about you, um, you said in some quote that you are a very unlikely pilgrim. Why that?
Well, I spent, wow, 35 years of my life behind a desk as the chief executive of a number of major organizations. I took taxis everywhere, and the only thing I ever wrote were financial reports. And then the Camino has led to completely changing my life. I would never have expected to enjoy walking. I would never have expected to start writing. And I would never have expected to live in Santiago de Compostela. That was not my plan. So I'm an unlikely pilgrim, but here I am.
Thank you so much. So we all, I guess, most of the pilgrims know, or Contra Camino, a life changing journey. And in another quote, you say that the Camino gave you a new life and a new meaning for your life. Can you explain us that?
Well, I love Spain and I love the peninsula and I love Portugal. And as the years were going on and my jobs were becoming more and more demanding and I was enjoying them less and less and less, I started to spend more time in Spain, actually in Seville. And I'm a church organist. That's the great hobby I have in my life, playing the organ in church. And I started playing the organ in a church in Seville for about 5 or 6 summers. Every summer I went to Seville, I rented a house, I played the organ in a beautiful church, and I made friends, and I was having lunch under the orange trees. And of course, I imagined, I imagined that I was going to retire and live in the south of Spain, in Seville, and travel around and sip chilled sherry under an orange tree and play the organ. And that was my plan for life. And then I went to dinner to a friend's house, and he said to me, whilst Jenny is in the kitchen preparing dinner, come and I'll show you what she's been doing. And he took me into a room, and there on the wall was a map of the north of Spain, the north coast of Spain, with a red line going along it. And of course, it was the Camino Frances. I'd never heard of the Camino de Santiago. And on this red line was a picture of his wife Jenny with a rucksack walking along. And she was doing it in stages, and every stage she did, they moved the photograph. Well, over dinner, she told me about this experience. She told me about the Camino and the history and walking and blisters and meeting other pilgrims and the albergues and the fellowship and all the rest of it. And I started to think about this. And 4 years later, I set out from Seville. The 1st of January, as you know, is a great feast in the church, the Feast of Our Lady Mother of God.
Yes.
I played the organ in the church. I went home, I packed my rucksack, and on the 2nd of January 2007, I set out from Seville to walk the Via de la Plata to Santiago. And I remember looking back at the house saying, I'm going to return here and live here. But of course, by the 36 days later when I reached Santiago, everything had changed. And I sat in the cathedral at the Pilgrim's Mass, and I couldn't actually believe what I was seeing. The pilgrims it was the pilgrims' home. The pilgrims, their rucksacks were piled up. The pilgrims were sitting on the altar, sitting in the altar steps. The music started, and out came the priests, and I could see boots underneath their robes, pilgrim priests in the Pilgrim's Church. And I thought, this is the place for me. And here I am.
So, when you decided to live in Santiago, and why?
Well, so after that first pilgrimage, the woman who was in charge of the Confraternity of St. James in the United Kingdom said to me, "What are you going to do now?" And I thought, well, I'd like to walk the Camino Inglés. So she said to me, well, there is no real guidebook to the Camino Inglés. We have some walking notes. So I walked the Camino Inglés from Ferrol to Santiago, only 5 days. Thought this was wonderful. But I was updating the notes. And when I got home, I produced a guidebook. I wrote a guidebook to the Camino Inglés. And of course, that was the start. Well, now, 2 weeks ago, I published another book. That's my 16th book on the Camino de Santiago published. So I was doing all of this, and then I started spending more time in Santiago. And I said to a priest, Don Genaro, who was the director of the Pilgrim's Office, now sadly dead, would you like a volunteer? And of course, it was all employees employed by the cathedral, and I was the first volunteer. And I started doing volunteering work in the Pilgrim's Office, writing Compostelas, and I loved that. That was in 2008. I loved that, and every month I started spending more and more time here. Eventually, I realised that there's a story attached to that, how I moved here. So, in around about 2008. I started spending the majority of my time here in Santiago.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Living there, as for me, as it's my special place, and living
Let me
there.
tell you another little story.
Please.
So, I was renting a room in a hotel at the beginning, and the hotel people said to me, "Listen, this hotel is quite expensive. Across the road, our sister has a little hostel for students. She will give you a room at a more reasonable price." So I started doing that. And then one day in the Pilgrim's Office, my best friend here in Santiago, a chap called Danny Vargas, said to me, "John, you come here all the time. In my family, we have an apartment that we don't use. Would you like it?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to see it." So about 10 minutes from the cathedral, he took me to a building. We went in. It had an elevator. So we went up in the elevator to the 4th floor, and he opened a door. Now, here was this very beautiful reformed apartment. It had been his partner's grandmother's house. The grandmother died. Her mother took over the apartment, completely renovated it. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, wooden floors, looking at the spires of the cathedral. And then her mother died, and she was left with this apartment, and she simply closed the door. It was like the story of the Marie Celeste. Sitting on the table were the women's cigarettes. So the place it was as if it was preserved in time. And of course, I then negotiated a rent, started staying there, and well, the rest is history. And I've been here ever since.
That's amazing. Do you remember when you came to know about the Camino? You already said it was in your friend's house in Seville. But when you realized that the Camino was a must thing to do?
Well, it was in my mind. It was in my mind for 4 years before I walked the first Camino. And then having walked the Via de la Plata, I felt compelled to do more, to walk more. And I'm very lucky because this year, this COVID year, I've walked